Entranced by my right.
Is our,
We're here.
oh, there we are on the screen. Okay, we are back, 1 o'clock. So let's get on with our last subject for today, the State Climate Adaptation Framework.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Commissioners, Erin Doyle, Government Relations Manager, covering the draft 2020 Climate Change Adaptation Framework that's been presented to stakeholders for comment by the state. I just want to state at the beginning that this work is complicated and crosses all departments. I just happen to be the one tagged by GR, but my colleagues are very engaged in this as well as every department at the county level. So we're going to discuss the draft 2020 Climate Change Adaptation Framework and working towards a policy question. And you have a document in front of you that I just provided. So if I could get the next slide, please. That document that I handed you is the potential direction, but I need the board's direction before we actually get into the substance of that document. So this presentation, I want to kind of set some groundwork here. This is narrowly tailored to the specific question of whether or not the board wants to provide a response to the state about the 2020 Climate Change Adaptation Framework. It does not establish that the county will be doing anything in particular related to climate change work, to climate change adaptation, to resilience planning, to internal planning, any of that. This is very much about whether or not the board wants to engage with the state as they set up their framework for how they will be dealing with climate change adaptation moving forward, as started in the process of this framework. So this is the question, and I'm reminding you at the beginning so that we can focus on that as we go through this presentation, of the question we're asking, we as county staff are asking you as a board to give us what direction you want us to head in. So next slide. To help you get there, I want to do two things. First is a high-level review of what the framework is and is not. I'm not going to rehash the memo that was included in the packet. That is not worth any of our time, and I'm trying not to be paid by the word this week. And then the second thing I want to present to you is kind of a little bit more context and detail into the staff-identified areas for potential feedback related to the framework. If the board is going to, just to give you a groundwork so that you can then make a decision based on staff's feedback to you. But you have hopefully all read one of my many lengthy memos on this particular topic. I'm doing my best to take a 45-page document and create less and less reading for each of you. I will be happy to answer questions as we go through everything, but let's start in on the background on the framework. Next slide, please. So first, I want to give us some context as to how we got to this conversation today, not just as to what the framework is, but to how the framework was presented to us. So, next slide. This is, again, Elizabeth is touting how to build a timeline in PowerPoint. So we're doing our best to create more sequential timelines so that you can kind of see the flow of things. So you'll see that on August 31st, an email was sent out from the state to people who are on their mailing list, sending a notice of a comment period and a release of the draft itself. So August 31st, this comes into me, and I did a quick outreach to specific departments who it was clear might be impacted by the framework and said, is this something that we need to take to the board to see if we should be providing comments back to the state? And in 5 days, those departments provided pretty substantive information back to me that made it clear that I needed to have a conversation with the CAO's office and make sure that we were all headed in the right direction and make a plan for presenting to you today. Vacations intervened, but we created a plan for feedback for each department to get back to me so that I could consolidate all of this and bring it to you. I would like to first take a huge shout out and thank you to every single department and department head who worked so hard to get such good information to me so fast out of their staff. There's a lot going on at the county, you may have heard, and their ability to provide that feedback in a timely manner, but not just timely, but robustly, was much appreciated, so that I didn't have to make it all up as I went along. So we did outreach to every department head at department head meeting. I provided them with a summary email and asked some very specific questions for them to respond so that I could provide the right feedback to you about whether or not we should be engaging in this process with the state. Like the framework proposes for the state, if we are going to continue down this path of interacting on this, there will be a need for an internal coordination process across departments, because it is very clear that there is not a department at the county that is unimpacted by the implications of the framework. In looking out a little bit further on that timeline, there is one typo. You got the information on Friday, not on the 6th. But then the highlighted thing here is that comments are due back to the state on October 30th, which is part of the reason why we've rushed to get to where we are, so that there's sufficient time for you to provide substantive feedback after this first presentation. Your schedules are fairly packed in the next couple of weeks, but if needs be, I'm happy to come back during your discussion time if we need to have further conversation. But that would give us plenty of time to get sufficient comments back, drafted, and sent off to the state within their timelines.
Erin, can I just interject here? That is why Erin had taken the liberty at writing some draft comments just for consideration. We are not trying to get out ahead of the board on this, but we're just sensitive to the timing and the board's time.
Yes, thank you. The future work as outlined on this slide is at the state level, and that is based on the framework that the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the department that's heading up this framework process at the state level, put out in the beginning of this year. So they had been planning to be a little bit further down the comments process than they were. So it's unclear to me if they have made decisions about how to adjust these timeframes. But really what's going to happen through October and November are revisions. And this is where comments may impact those revisions. But eventually there is a plan for the department and the governor's office to present it to the legislature, but also to adopt it as part of the Oregon Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan, which is a statewide planning process that makes us eligible for FEMA dollars. So the framework being part of how we are going to react to natural hazards and plan for and prepare for emergencies before they occur, which makes us eligible for increased funding should a natural hazard occur. It's just smart planning and good finances. So next slide, please. Please.
Under March, you've got 2020, you need to modify that to 21?
Yeah, I just feel like I'm forever stuck in 2020. Thank you for that note. I will make sure that moving forward that gets corrected. So what is the framework and what is the framework not? Terrible English, but accurate question. So the framework itself is a very high-level document that focuses on creating resilience and providing a structure for ensuring state agencies are actively pursuing this focus within all of their work, not just when they're doing an adaptation project, but as they are looking across their programs, across their planning, how they incorporate climate change adaptation into the work they do day to day. 24 separate state agencies were included in the process of developing this framework. That ranges from obviously DLCD, who took the lead, to Oregon Health Authority, to Department of State Lands, and the Business Oregon. What it is not is a document that has strict outcomes or policy prescriptions that will be executed. There is going to be follow-up work that state agencies have to undertake. They will do it at a budgetary level, a legislative level, a community engagement level, and a regulatory level. And that's what the framework really is that long-term, high-level documentation, so we know the process by which they will approach each of these conversations. Next slide, please. So the framework is structured to kind of provide 5 specific areas of action for the state to undertake. I'm not going to walk you through all 5. That is in my memo. I will answer questions if you have it, but I do want to focus on a couple of areas of action that I think are really important for the county to recognize as it coordinates with the work that we are doing as a county. First is on the diversity, equity, inclusion work. It specifically calls out that model tools will be created for local governments. And I think that that is a really great opportunity to us as we work as a county to improve our DEI and community engagement efforts, to really see programs that work at a statewide level, but also to influence how the state addresses our inclusion, our equity concerns, and our diversity within the Washington County. The DEI work that the framework calls for is a very intentional system of outreach to the vulnerable communities that are identified. And vulnerable communities in the framework are identified as the BIPOC communities, low-income communities, and rural communities. And those were selected because they're considered frontline to climate change ramifications, and therefore need to be at the table to create the decisions that impact how their ways of life will or will not be changed and where they can remain safer during times of natural disaster. The other area I wanted to highlight was the vulnerability assessment. In looking at the intention of having a more comprehensive statewide assessments of areas of vulnerability, there is a likelihood that it will be used as one basis for prioritizing funding for state projects and grants. Having this tool, however, if the county is working on something related to a vulnerability that is identified in the assessment, it may increase the chances that we're eligible for those grants, either at the state level or from private entities. The other advantage that the vulnerability assessment provides, as identified by staff, is that it could be a useful tool for either modeling work at the local level here at the county as part of our review of our facilities or the infrastructure that we create. The infrastructure, particularly where we see Clean Water Services and the LUT work overlap to create more resilient and adaptive responses to natural hazards along our roadways and our significant capital investments. Commissioner Trees.
Is the vulnerability assessment only about the natural world, or does it, for example, wildfires, floods, those types of things, does it also include, I don't know, population changes because of climate refugees, that type of thing?
I do not recall off the top of my head, and I'm about to pull it up because I knew that I wouldn't remember all of the document as I moved forward. Except I can't spell vulnerability. I think it's looking at a lot of aspects, and there is a constant community engagement in that process. And so there's a, let me find my picture. They're looking at the exposure risks and the sensitivity. So it's very much more focused on the natural environment and the ramifications to the natural environment. Sorry, I knew I knew the answer somewhere. It's less adaptive, I think, than looking at that future scoping of the size of the population.
I found the information on page 34 of the document really helpful towards that end. But we do know that there are not yet econometric trends to support climate refugee population migration trends. This is something that the population forecasters at Metro, who work closely with PSU and the state, are tracking. This question's been raised for over 10 years, but we just don't have data yet to demonstrate that. So it keeps coming up anecdotally, but we're not able to.
There's no basis.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that there's a recognition of within the framework itself. If you, under the information sharing and coordination, there's a lot of discussion about data sets that they do and don't have and what they need to coordinate better to create that type of data that would be very useful in long-term vulnerability assessments.
Thank you.
So any other questions on this slide? Then I'll have us go to the next slide. The other thing that the framework did to kind of hang its clothing on is do some sector analysis. Again, not going to focus on the particulars related to all 6 sectors. That's in the memo and in the framework itself. But the framework identifies potential vulnerabilities within those sectors and then creates strategic responses that the state will undertake to address those specific vulnerabilities. Parsing out these sectors, I will say, if you read the framework, it's impossible because they all overlap, particularly if you look at the economy and the natural world, our diversity of natural-based industry here, timber harvest from a couple weeks ago, for example, but also water supply, those sorts of things. There's a significant overlap. So while there's this six-sector analysis, it's not as clean as we would necessarily expect. But in Washington County, our geography, economy, demographics, and services are represented across the board within all 6 of these sectors. And therefore, it's very important for us to understand how the framework responses might impact county work. As we continue to provide the community services, one key sector that I've seen this board invest in is that one that the state identifies as social systems. And while it's kind of hard to see on the screen, this little graphic is included in the framework to kind of parse out what they mean by social systems impact on resilience. And this is really focused on making sure that there are multiple lines of communication into the community so that everyone can come to the table, so that everyone knows where they can get the resources, and that there are places where people are comfortable to come that aren't just you have to go to the board and sit in at a meeting. And I think that is very much the engagement work that this board is very intentionally and specifically looking to implement. So I think that there are some real opportunities within the framework to add our voice to how this is effective from a local perspective, but also in each of these things, we have to be very careful of the balances that we as a county have in providing services across the geography, across the demographics, and across the services that this county provides. So are there any questions related to the framework or its context that aren't terribly technical? Okay, next slide. So I'm going to provide a little bit more of the highlights around the county department's feedback. And I took all of the feedback that I got and I wanted to do a fancy word cloud, but apparently I have to buy software to do that, so I didn't. But it could be very easily grouped in conscious themes. So let's go through those. Next slide, please. So the first thing that was identified across the board were there's some significant opportunities within this framework for how we can do county work better and how we can interact with the state as they undertake executing on the strategic responses within the framework. So where departments are already modeling best practices, that is what we're talking about in enhancing county work already underway. I will say that Clean Water Services provided me an extensive detailed list of all of the places where they're already ahead of the game of what's called out in the framework, for example. But our public health department is also working on this. Our LUT department is working on this. And it's because we're working on things that aren't just they're not about one problem that they're trying to solve. Our departments are working to solve multiple problems with one project or program. So where our county is starting to adjust our processes to become best practices and reacting to the variety of competing interests that are out there in the county, the framework is identifying some state-level tools that will provide a model for our departments to potentially enact, if the board decides to prioritize that work, of course. You'll see that in here. This is where I recalled the question, or the answer to the question, Commissioner Treese, that framework of the graphic of how a vulnerability assessment process works, and showing that there's an equity focus at all points in time, and that there's the technical work of identifying the exposure to drivers of change and the sensitivity of an area, to then finalizing what we assess as the impact, but then what is our capacity to adapt to it. That is a model tool that our support services department said would really help them as they look at facilities planning in the future and making sure that what we build and what we invest in as a county has that resilience to it. And there are co-benefits there again, such as if we're building resilient to natural hazards, we're probably also building seismically resilient infrastructure, for example. So those are some of the opportunities at a very high level. There's more details that I can provide if you would like. Questions about these identified opportunities. Okay. Then next slide, please. So ongoing monitoring is areas where staff noted that there's potential concerns or potential impacts to how the county does business that will require us to be engaged in the process in the long term, not just at the time that the framework comes out. So as always, when the state changes its prioritization or its policies or its programs or its budgeting, there is a potential for unfunded mandates. And we have to be very careful of those because, as I think Jack's earlier presentation today highlighted in some of our areas, budgets are already going to be tough as a result of what has happened in 2020. But there are some potential revenue impacts to some of the strategic responses that are identified within the framework as well. And we need to make sure that those two things coupled together, plus new work, doesn't equal an unfunded mandate. But a lot of what is identified by the departments is about the fact that this framework is really high level. It's sometimes hard to know what the outcome is going to be, which creates uncertainty for county funding, projects, and work product. And as new regulatory structures are developed, departments may have to divert staff and resources to track what's happening at the state level and to ensure that the county remains in compliance, because it's better to stay in compliance than have to rework an entire significant natural resources plan in a shortened, compressed timeframe under a court order. Similarly, if funding is reprogrammed, it can both serve as an opportunity to receive funding for work that the county will undertake, but like the county, redirection of state funds limits them in other areas. And finally, there are a number of particular components that are missing from the framework and staff has made suggestions for inclusions of items like transit investment within the built environment consideration, scenario planning tools, because as you noted, we turn to the demographers for information to do our long-term planning on. But the framework does call for looking at more of what's that scenario of the natural disaster, where is the flooding likely to happen, and those sorts of things that we have not traditionally done in long-term planning. Those are new tools, there's an expense there, but it's how you use them and how they fit into the land use goals that really matters. Or even the lack of a specific plan for how to engage with local government moving forward. And I think that to me is the one thing that I really noted in the framework without staff direction, but it was noted by multiple members of staff as well. Next slide. So now we will turn to what you all feel. As CAO Angie stated, I have provided that draft language to you as a time-saving exercise if there is a decision by this board that we should engage at this point in the process related to the framework. So next slide, please. So the question first for the board is, do you want to provide staff that direction of how to respond to the state's draft 2020 climate change adaptation framework? And now I stop talking.
Wow. The reason why I need to take a breath for a moment, well, other than I'm wearing a really hot mask today. My face is bothering me. Feels very hot. This framework is coming together. So my assumption is that there will be a framework and that we may have to follow it, whether it's in a whole as a county or in our pursuit of funding through other programs. So there are multiple opportunities for involvement. We could provide general comments, but as I think about that, in the framework being further developed, I think about, okay, well, but do we need to be a major player in shaping it? I've also challenged myself to think about, all right, once the state has it, there is an approach of just following it through our work versus leading on it. I'm also have reminded myself that several of us on this board have experience already with the state around climate change and needing to develop plans. The most recent one is the Climate Smart Communities work that our region, including this county, participated in very actively in meeting the statewide goals that were adopted by the legislature in 2005 and then in 2007, particularly around reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, because if we reduce emissions there, then it gives us more flexibility for greenhouse gas emissions from, say, the manufacturing sector. And this metropolitan region has done a really good job over decades in managing that, which has benefited companies, specifically Intel and PGE operations here in this region and this county specifically. But as this framework talks about, we're not on track to meeting those goals. I am a little bit leery about the idea of leading versus following, because as this county has participated to meet these state requirements through the regional requirements placed on us, we've been reliant upon state funding. You mentioned light rail as one of them. We have multiple techniques. Then Mayor Willie participated in all of this regional agreements, and the state has not come through with that yet. Understandably so. So I'm really on the lookout for unfunded mandates. But I do appreciate that they are doing this work. It needs to be done. Like it or not, we are all going to have to adapt. It's work we're going to have to do or suffer worse consequences because of by not doing it. So I have a very mixed message here. Willing to provide some comment, but not derail our limited staff availability for other things, because there is so much going on.
And if I may, Chair, I think that that is actually, so in the draft comments that I made, I do highlight that.
Which drafts in your
the-
other letter,
the-
the most recent?
The one that as potential comments, the ones
Page
labeled
four-
that
the 4 pages.
the 4-page potential letter, which
Sorry,
can of
I've only
course
gotten
be.
to the top of page 2.
I don't know why I gave you a full 2 minutes to read it.
My speed reading's not as good as yours.
Yeah, no, I just I wrote it so I can remember some of what I said, not all of it. But one of the things that I think is really important, and this goes back to one of the noted things is by staff, is that there's an opportunity cost for us as the state moves forward with the framework, and I don't think that that's accounted for in the framework, and that's why I think. If you were to ask my opinion, I don't think we would necessarily be considered leading by providing these comments. I think we would be seen as participating, which is an important step when we want to later, again, anticipate work that will come out of the state. And if we fail to note that the state has failed to note that state agency work then has a downstream effect to those local governments that actually implement the regulatory structure, both in having to abide by it, but also then land use, very much one of those places where the state sets the rules and then we enforce how to follow them at the local level. If we are adjusting consistently because there's new rules coming through and each department at the 24 state agencies making changes, means that LUT gets impacted by 3 different new rules, or Clean Water Services has to interact with 6 agencies as they all adjust their water riparian access, or however it ends up fleshing itself out. So by noting these comments at the beginning of the process, it gives us a place where we can say, we told you, adjust your framework or adjust your workload because we've informed you. And otherwise, please show us the money, to quote a movie. So I think that there's an advantage to providing the comments, but I think that the comments need to reflect both the things that the county has already taken a leadership role at the local level on, and how we see partnership opportunity there, and how we'd like to see that continued through into those areas where we know as a county we'll have to monitor regardless of whether we provide comments. And I think that's the direction that the letter that I did provide, and it's provided now knowing that you will not have time to actually read it and provide comprehensive feedback that I've gotten everything, but I think it's a way to show you the direction that I think our comments can go. And it is a really lengthy potential letter, but I think it also doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying Washington County will be a leader in this area. We're saying as we work with the state, you need to consider where we are as a resource agency.
Who's this letter coming from? Is it coming from the CAO on behalf of staff level work, or are we trying to get to something that we want to have attached to the board members?
That is another piece of direction I would need from you.
So here's
yeah.
where I'm really a bit lost.
Okay.
Or, yeah. Today's the 13th. They're due the 30th. But if we're going to attach our name to it, then I need time to read this letter. I want to make sure that it's organized under some key message themes. I really appreciate all the work that staff has gone through and that you have put into author-based comments. So those are, thank goodness you've done that already. But I just need the 2 simple steps
Yeah.
before the 30th, and I better pull out a calendar to know what I'm even asking of you. I'm always uncomfortable otherwise.
Chair, can I ask you a question?
So if we could go to the
There's
last
2
slide.
more weeks, but the 30th is a Friday.
Yeah.
And
So I wanted to provide this slide because I did think.
Oh,
I was anticipating some further thoughts by the board as I didn't finalize my presentation on the question for the board. Just kind of giving you a basis of the timeline. So there is 2 weeks and 2 board meetings within those weeks by which you could continue to have a conversation with staff if that is the direction you would like to have. If your preference is to have the board see if they can get to a place where they can all sign on to a letter and have the letter come from the board. There is alternatives by which I can work with CAO Angie at your direction with your feedback and making sure that your directions are reflected within the letter, but not necessarily having to come back to you, but have it under her signature. And then there's always, I am also extremely respectful of the amount of work that our departments and department heads are doing. But if there's a third leg to that stool of potentially having, each department with my assistance send under their directors. They've not heard that though, so I think I just scared about 13 people, and CAO Angie's telling me no, we're not doing that. Yeah, so that's okay.
I didn't follow that.
That's
so-
perfect.
What I am a little worried about, though, I just reminded myself, look at there, I actually read your prior memo, too. I had completely forgotten about it already. I mean, on one hand, I feel like, yes, we do want to comment. But on the other hand, if I heard you right, there's going to take some internal coordination. And here we are in this landscape, financial landscape, where we're resource poor, not resource rich. And so where do we find the resources to do that? So anyway, I think I've said enough for now. Let's keep the conversation going amongst all commissioners.
I think that Commissioner Willie had a question.
Well, I thought I heard in your opening comments that you were asking if we, as a commission, wanted to be peripherally involved in this or directly involved in this. Did I misunderstand? Because I thought that's kind of the direction we were going initially. Did I misunderstand that?
So I'm going to ask a question back. By this, did you hear peripherally involved in the framework or peripherally involved in this, the direction that the county would be heading in relationship to the framework? Because my intention was to see if, in coming to you, seeing if there is direction that the board would like to provide staff on how to approach the framework. Do we engage now in this place where they have sought our comments, or do we watch and see what occurs and then be more actively engaged as the strategic responses start to roll out of the state? It's about, do you want to have staff take down where you feel that the county is in relationship to the draft of the framework, or is this the moment where we're not at the place as a county to provide that framework feedback? And then we can forego reading that 4-page draft letter, which is why we're here today. I need to know what is the direction that the board wants to go? How engaged do you want to be with this framework process? So did I?
I think so.
Okay.
So I don't know if I should ask a question
Go ahead and
about
ask,
that.
and then I have a couple.
So in a way, this is what I needed to do is I almost wish that was a whiteboard because I then needed to bring back the timeline that you have for taking this out through March of 2021,
Right.
right?
It's,
It's
yeah,
on
I'm trying to find the slide number. It's slide number 5. Yeah, so
Because I'm perfectly comfortable with our participating this way and providing comments in. I think where we're going to be really challenged, or I am challenged as a board member, while I'm interested in seeing the county be successful in climate adaptation, I know I don't have the bandwidth to participate myself through March of 2021.
So let me clarify this then. That future work is all done at the state level. It's not work to be done by the county. I'm sorry, I didn't clarify that. So, I mean, there is.
Yeah, but we know for sure that as soon as it's presented to the legislators, that they're going to have questions.
Yeah.
And we can push all that on our wonderful GR team if we'd like.
What you pay me for. And I think that one thing that isn't clear, and is if there's going to be another opportunity with another draft of this framework. So I think that's part of the reason why the rush to get this to you over the last month and have that comprehensive staff feedback is because the future work as laid out by the state doesn't appear to have provided for another public comment period as they've make drafts, which is very complicated. There's also a comment that I may have included in the draft letter that I provided to you 2 minutes before all of this. So I think that the work level really for the county isn't relative to the framework. I think a lot of that groundwork has already been done with the comments that have been summarized and brought to you today. I think the vast majority of the work and the constraint are the problems we're going to see constraints on our budgets and our ability to meet the strategic responses is as they roll out those programmatic changes. And that's where our comments now help paint that picture for the future of the work done at state agencies. And that's why I do believe that the comments coming now aren't necessarily asking for Washington County to lead on this or necessarily putting us in a position to accept or reject any particular proposed solution, but gives us a first toe in the water of saying, as you start this process, here's how you need to interact with respecting the county's limited bandwidth and how we are also prioritizing some of this work. We are engaging best practices, and that needs acknowledgement.
And you've, as you've indicated, you've got
Some of it's in
messaging
there.
in there already.
So when I think about our engagement level, we are the second largest by population county in the state. We are the largest employment center, you know, the old economic engine concept. I say old. The most diverse county. And we're also a county that has been at the hands of disasters, whether it's the flooding we've experienced, the fires, the droughts that we've experienced, the watershed issues that we've experienced. I don't want to overstate how important I think it is that we are engaged in one of the most important discussions that's going on here in our state as well as across the country. That doesn't mean that we have to be in the weeds on this and leading the charge, but I really don't want us to be perceived to be absent from the discussion. So that's what's important to me. I also think that issues like the fact that we're the most diverse county in the state plays into that the socioeconomic piece of climate change and where the effects are and how they are different for different groups. We've got the makeup of our county from the agricultural and the urban perspective is fairly unique as well. We're not Multnomah County and we're not Harney County. But we have a very important voice, I think, to have at the table. Again, I don't think we need to be leading the conversation, but I really don't want us not to be in the conversation. And maybe that wasn't helpful to you, but I think it's important that we're at the table.
I think that's the recommendation that staff's already
Yeah.
made to us.
And I'm making that, and I'm trying to reinforce that with my fellow commissioners right now.
Well, I mean, I note here on page 5, I notice on page 5 of this attachment for our work session today, what's the actual,
Which letter?
The
The
memo
original,
dated
the
October 8th.
the memo of October 8th, yeah.
Yep.
You say that the 2020 framework is a high-level document, so it's a challenge to identify specific policy or programs. So I guess I suspect that means that's not really an appropriate thing for us to do in our comments. But it is possible to identify areas where the county will want to note impacts and opportunities, and then you frame 6 questions. I think they're pretty good questions. And then you talk about each one of them. And there's some generalized language about, you know, we're concerned about how these state programs will be aligned with one another and how that may risk conflict with our programs. So I'm okay with bearing in mind that this is a high-level document, this framework 2020, and that we could just simply raise some red flag issues and talk a little bit about some things that we're doing that we'd like to continue with. And I would support a letter like that, a letter along those lines.
And I mean, I don't want to get in too deep into the thing that I presented this morning that doesn't actually have a date on it. So it has a date up in the top. It's marked October 13th. And Commissioner Rogers, who's joined us, should have been emailed to you. So that is I took similar structuring from this memo and placed it into that. I would like, I think this conversation isn't completed by the board yet, but if we are to move forward in that direction of providing comments, I don't want to say that that draft is ready. It's definitely in need of further feedback to make sure that I've struck that balance between where we perceive our role as far as leadership, but also how we are positioned geographically and demographically and economically as a jurisdiction, but also as a service provider, because that's the piece I think has been very important. A lot of what HHS noted is that there's a recognition of the importance of public health in the adaptivity of the state, and that investments, I don't know that I focused on that in my presentation, but it is throughout the comments. And so making sure all of those different pieces get into the letter without the letter being a thesis, which I am notoriously capable of writing. So that letter suggests a starting point if the board wants to continue. But I hear you saying that we don't have the capacity to be the leaders in this conversation, but I don't think providing comments at this time sets us up for that quite yet.
Again, to finish up what I was going since the framework itself is a high-level document, I think our response should be very high level. And I would, if there's some ways that we can cut this letter down to, I mean, it runs 4 pages, I think it probably, we ought to be able to touch on a couple of the high-level points and very briefly touch on some of those 6 questions in perhaps in a couple of pages, 2.5 pages, or something rather than 4.
Part of the challenge of this letter is that you're providing input both for Washington County and Clean Water Services, so rather than having 2 separate letters. And so in that regard, I'm fine with it being a multi-page letter. It's just I'm missing the sort of the thematic flow of it, that's all. But Diane, just one last thing. I think the other thing that, going back to, and I need to remind myself Commissioner Rogers is on Zoom. In looking at the October 8th memo to us, I came in the latter part of the document to the realization that we are the county in 2 roles. And we are first and foremost a county as a county, a provider of county-wide services, public health, housing, HHS. And so when the state thinks of us, they think of us like a county, like the other 36 counties that have common county-wide services, right? And that is reinforced by the 2 emergencies that we have, now 3 with the economic one, but pandemic, economic crisis, and wildfires. We also have the uniqueness of being a urban unincorporated area manager. And and the county has been through this cycle numerous times already, where it isn't a city and the state has difficulty dealing with us like a city, and we're not resourced to support the electorate in the UUAs like cities are. And so I think that's going to be very challenging as we move forward, not only with the migration from a framework to the Oregon Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan. So I just wanted to make sure to point that out. And Commissioner Rogers, do you have any questions or comments at this point?
Thank you. Sorry, I was 20 minutes trying to get onto our line, so I've been listening to a lot of it, but I haven't been able to participate, at least from a video standpoint. No, Aaron, I appreciate the time that you brought this to us. I know it's very difficult because you have very little time, and so you're trying to crowd something into a very compact agenda that we have. And heaven knows we've got enough other issues. I appreciate it. I got, Kevin sent me the information that you handed out right before this session. I frankly have not prepared at all to take any position. So if it's every one of us has to sign on, I'm not willing to do that personally. I appreciate the work. I know we have to participate in it. And so if there's something carefully be crafted to allow us to participate without taking any positions, I think that's really good. I think that's what the chair was trying to poke at, but maybe I didn't understand fully. But that's where I would be. I don't want to sign on to something that says for me anyway, I take any position. I want to read through more carefully the information of the 10 or 15 minutes that I got it before the meeting. And then to say it's important that we participate because we certainly are all in this discussion with one another. So that's where I'm at.
I have a question. We've been talking about whether or not we would be a leader in the discussion. Who do you anticipate will be leaders in the discussion?
That is the question that the framework presents a complication to me for. And this is where there's been, within the framework itself, there is a heavy, clear engagement with how community-based organizations get more participatory in the process. And I don't know that they've reached out to local government in quite the same way. So my suspicion would be that as AOC is now more robustly staffed than they had been, they're going to be tapped to try to be the leaders within that conversation. But I'm not sure that they have yet engaged in this framework, as their natural resources group focuses on a lot more of the rural areas and wildfire response, to be frank. I think that the tight timelines have prevented any local government leadership to come out of the process. So from a local government perspective, I don't know that there's yet identified a leader. And I wouldn't want us, by participating in the process, to become a de facto leader. That's not the intention. So I don't think I have an answer to your question, which is problematic.
I'm trying to figure out what the landscape is here.
What is your opinion, based on your experience leading up to this point, for how, say, the League of Cities may want to participate? I'm just asking you an opinion.
I think most associations will see if there's someone with the bandwidth and an interest from their membership. The League of Oregon Cities would probably have both their policy advisors related to land use and planning, but also the water and sewer providers, and then the economics person take a look at it and determine whether or not there was sufficient interest within the membership. And that's the difficulty there, is that like AOC, every county, every city looks very different. And so they might not choose to engage at this point in time related to the framework. But I have not spoken to them about where they are with this.
So I think what we have is, thanks to your involvement and the department investment of time, we have information from all of you that gives us a feel for what the departments have assessed. We know that if we're going to provide comments, it's needed by October 30th. We have a draft letter from, a first draft, I'll
It's
call
a
it that.
straw man for you
Yeah.
to deal with.
So how about this as a proposal, commissioners, for next steps? We all have the opportunity to review this straw man letter, and we come back to the subject either the 20th or 27th, and have discussion around it and provide you with some input for our level of comfort on some shape around what you've proposed here. And that's where I would prefer, if possible, to have like a half-hour conversation about it on the 20th. I'm looking to our CAO because she probably has her fingers, oh, right, I'm sorry, Diane, right on the what's on the October 20th agenda, and I don't at the moment. And that'll still give some time relative to the 30th. Thank you, Diane, for your patience. I'm sorry.
Yeah, ours is sort of the technical wonky side of this, right? So there's really three major components of issues, and it would be great if Mark Jockers could work with Aaron to structure the Clean Water Services part of the response. So the first one is the impact of the framework on utility operations, because we purchase a lot of electrical energy and we also create methane gas. There are inherent offsets that will need to be created because of our operations. So that's something we want to watch for. The second one is unintended sort of policy consequences as they interact between DEQ, water resources, ag and forestry, and the natural resources. Inherent in this conversation is carbon offsets. And this could go to the core of what Clean Water Services has created, right? And so we plant trees because of thermal offset that's necessary. If there is a policy where you can't environmentally stack, and what that means is we could not take credit for these trees for thermal offset and carbon offset, that begins creating some issues. And there has been past history where some folks didn't like this concept of environmental stacking, but a tree is a tree, and it does all sorts of wonderful things for the environment. So that's another policy area we want to watch for. We're also concerned about policies that drive competition in terms of land and the planting of trees, because right now we're extremely cost effective because we have partners that bring land for free. But the moment there's a shift to carbon offset market creation, it creates a whole different dynamic that we need to be very careful of. And I think it'd be great, we'll work with Aaron. I think it's fabulous that we put a unified letter together, but I think we could work on the specific policy things. And you did a nice job talking about these issues sort of in trying to get to those points.
I wanted to kind of just raise this back up, though. I don't think the framework gets that detailed into that type of policy framework and specific components of how we get to the end and what rules and regulations we are. So I want to be very careful that, like Commissioner Schouten stated, our level is the same level as the states. I don't want to dig into details that don't exist within the framework. I think that puts us too far into a leadership role. So I'd be happy to work with Mark to make sure that I'm getting that balance correct and anticipatory.
We can see where this is going. So, yeah, so it's balancing both, yeah.
Well, there could also be a need to cover that level of detail in concert but separately, particularly as carbon legislation is moving along. So they're in parallel. There's a relationship there, but at a different level currently.
And I will also I just want to plant this flag. The framework is not the carbon bill. It is very different.
Yes.
And that's why I think this is a very tight set of comments. So, but I don't know if,
So I'm looking at the agenda for next week, and we have a very full agenda. So we'll go back to timing and see if we can squeeze in 30 minutes for this. As a next step, I would suggest that staff take back what we've heard today and redraft the draft letter. One of the suggestions, Aaron, that I would have so that we would have salient points at the beginning of the letter is maybe include what actions the county is taking as an addendum or an attachment to the letter. What I'm hearing from the board is draft comments, express appreciation for the opportunity to express comments at this time, and that we would like to be included throughout the process to provide additional input. I'm throwing that out there as draft language, and I'm verbally processing based on what I heard, so we can draft this and bring this back to the board. I will say, I think we can be succinct and then provide the supporting material, including some of the supporting material that Diane had expressed from Clean Water Services.
So as I was listening and internalizing that, I was also recalling that particularly in the 2019 legislative cycle, there were multiple items, bills, topics for discussion with committees. They weren't at the bill level necessarily, where our HHS staff provided the letters. And sometimes they came to us just to make sure we were comfortable with their line of commenting, but it was still a letter from the department. And so there are different ways to skin the cat, to say that this is, it could be a letter from the CAO and the CEO of Clean Water Services jointly, so it's reflective of us taking a look, and that this has been shared with the board, and we're supportive of the agency continuing to process and provide input at this stage, as opposed to it being a letter from the board.
Yes, I think that was the second solution that.
Yeah, and
Well,
so- But I do think it would be good next week, at least in commissioner communication, to see if there is any comfort level. I don't want to go force it as a thumbs up, thumbs down, but if we have the opportunity to read the letter more than we've had today, are we generally comfortable with the direction?
I'm fine with that, and I will happily take another cut at having heard the feedback that I've already heard, knowing that you had like the limited amount of time to look at it. As I go through that, if you want to drop me an email about anything that strikes your fancy, I'd be happy to receive that feedback and then incorporate it into anything, and then have it where you have time to read it before the 20th, obviously, so.
Commissioners, does that sound like a reasonable approach at this stage?
Yes.
Sure, yeah. I think broad strokes, and you can also use something old-fashioned like footnotes, and if you want to get into some detail, you can put those in a footnote at the bottom of a page or something, or as an attachment, as an addendum.
I'm comfortable, and I want to thank you, Aaron, for the work that you've done to bring this together. I think that the combination of Clean Water Services and the county together makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate the fact that we won't be, we're registering our need and our desire to be a part of the conversation moving forward.
I would like to just say that I couldn't do this without an impressive amount of staff assistance across this county. So I want to just say that again and thank all of their leadership for making their staff available in this hard time. I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Good work, team. Thanks for taking us to new frontiers. All right, anything in closing? Commissioner Rogers, commissioners?
No, thank you.
Okay, well, that's it for today's edition of the Board of Commissioners Work Session for October 13th. Thank you.